conversation for a little bit, and then we'll open up to y'all to get some of your thoughts. I start all these kind of conversations, though, talking about where you grew up. So tell me about where you grew up.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say thank you for having me here today at the Clinton School. It's really a privilege for me to be here. And, you know, when Nikolai sent me an email a few months back with the invitation, my first thought was, does he really want me here? When you look at some of the people who have come here and spoken, former secretaries of state, important peoples in government and other areas, it's a significant message. And so why soccer? Why would this be something that would be useful to the people here at the Clinton School? And soccer really is the universal language around the world. It's something that unites countries, it's something that unites communities, and it's something, an area where the United States has an opportunity to represent ourselves in a different way. So I'm happy to talk about that today. I grew up in Maryland, about 20 minutes outside of Washington, D.C. I have an identical twin brother. We started playing soccer when I was 6 because my mom thought it was safer than football, and I've got a couple broken bones to prove otherwise. My brother also works in soccer. He is the director of soccer operations for the LA Galaxy. So yes, I've met David Beckham. And then, you know, we played since we were kids. We had a group of friends that started when we were 10 years old, and 30 years later are still some of our closest friends. So soccer's meant a lot to me, not just professionally, but personally too.
What did you want to be growing up?
I had no idea. And when I went to the University of Delaware, as you pointed out, my brother and I both went to the University of Delaware. I think my dad was probably the one who picked the college because, well, he was paying for it, and it was a place where we could go and play soccer. We had gone to visit a few schools, and the coach liked us, and we had a chance to play. So we went, and we went as agricultural business majors. I think I had a pretty decent GPA in high school and did okay on the SATs, but the coach said the only way we could get into the school was through the ag business program. So that was my first year. I could tell you a little bit about the difference between heifers and Holsteins. And then we became political science majors, and really just because we liked the courses, we liked the professors. But if you would ask me back then what I wanted to be when I grew up, I couldn't have told you.
And your decision to backpack after graduating, how did y'all make that?
Yeah, so I think my brother and I were always adventurers, and we were also foolish enough to think that nothing bad could happen. And being guys who grew up around soccer, you know, we watched when we were kids. It wasn't as easy as it was today to watch soccer on TV, but back then the only thing you could watch was soccer made in Germany. So anybody who's around my age or that generation would recognize the voice of Toby Charles, who was this really compelling English announcer. And so he kind of hooked us on the sport outside of the U.S. And so the opportunity to go overseas, to meet new people, to see soccer games live, probably have a couple beers in different countries too, was just something that was compelling, and we just picked up our backpacks and went.
How long were you gone that first trip?
Yeah, so we backpacked off and on for 2 years. We went to Europe. We were supposed to be there for 5 weeks. We wound up staying for 8. So a few changes of flights, a few calls to mom and dad, some for money. But we wound up staying 8 weeks, and we timed it so we could go to the European Cup final in 1994. It was played in Athens in Greece, and it was Milan against Barcelona. So we had bread and water for breakfast every day, cheese for lunch, and maybe something decent for dinner, so we could have enough money to make it to this game. It took us 2 days on a boat to get back to Athens for the game, and on the morning of the match, we went in to buy tickets, and we saved ourselves enough money where we could have some food, take the bus to the airport, and go straight from there to London, to New Jersey, back to D.C. And we bought the tickets, we have our day planned, and now we said, you know what? When are we going to have a chance to do this again? So we went back in, bought the most expensive tickets we could, and now we have no money. And this is back in 1994, so you're not going to an ATM machine if you run out. And we had to be back in London that night to make the flight. So we didn't make it there, we weren't making it home. We wound up experiencing a Greek airline strike, which delayed our flights back for about 4 hours, but we made it back we made it back with the skin of our teeth, and from there, we knew that's what we wanted to do.
What's your biggest lesson learned from those travels?
Well, I think, so you get asked this question a lot for people who like to travel. What's your favorite place to go? And that's a hard one to answer. I've been fortunate in both personal and professional travels to go to 57 countries. So how do you pick which one's the best? But what you wind up appreciating the most is the people you meet. You know, going on sightseeing tours, it's fascinating to learn about history and architecture and food, but the experiences that you have are the people that you meet. And the thing that I've always taken away from those trips is that people are just like us. You know, if they don't like, if you hear bad stuff about America, it's not about Americans. And that was never a barrier to places that we went. Even when we went to Vietnam, you know, we were there for a month, and my brother and I didn't know what to expect. You know, this is a place that obviously had been devastated decades before by the United States. And so what are they going to think of Americans who go there? And they couldn't have been nicer people. There isn't a place that we were more welcome in the world when we went there. And it's something that I've always taken away. And those same people that we met on the road are the people that we're still friends with today.
Come back in 94, and something's happening in soccer in the U.S. How'd you get involved in the World Cup?
So that's how I got into this in the first place. But my dad, his first job out of college, ironically in 1967, was with a professional soccer team. It was the old NESL, and he worked for the Washington Whips. And the PR director is a famous PR director in D.C. His name is Charlie Brotman. Charlie has been the host of every inaugural parade since Eisenhower. So he's a local legend in D.C., but he had a PR shop. And there's a professional tennis tournament in D.C. every summer. And my dad sold all the concessions. So he took his two 8-year-old boys down to the tournament for 1 week every summer, and Charlie ran all the PR stuff. So we used to run around the media tent, and as we got older, now we started clipping. You know, they had us clip newspaper articles, they had us make copies. Then as we got older, you know, we started writing bios and press releases. And so this is just how we got into this side of things. This is what we did 1 week every summer. And in 93, the US Cup was in the United States, which was kind of a dry run for the World Cup. And those guys ran the PR side. So my brother and I were volunteers. And then the next year was the World Cup in 94, and DC was one of the venues. Same thing. We just showed up as volunteers. You had to apply. And on game days, our job was to be photo runners. So back in 1994, they actually used film. I don't know if some of you have ever seen film before, but the photographers could get their film developed on site for the first time ever. So my brother and I would run down the end line, pick up bags of film, run down to the far side, pick up bags of film, run out of the stadium, drop it off, and run back in. And that was our gig on game days. On non-game days, we would just show up at the media center and say, what do you need us to do? So it was making copies. It was writing press releases. It was going to press conferences and taking pool quotes down so that you could make quote sheets. And I told the story last night. I got to do the Dutch team in 94. And I was sitting with the captain of the team and with a reporter, just with a tape recorder. So the guy asks a few questions, he gets up and leaves, and now the captain of the team says, well, do you have any questions for me? And I said, that's not what I'm here for. I'm just here to take notes. And he said, well, I don't mind. So I sat for 15 minutes and talked to the captain of the Dutch national team about soccer in the U.S., what he thought about the World Cup. But that only happened because we decided to show up. And the next year was the year the Major League Soccer was starting, and the chief press officer from the D.C. venue of the World Cup became the director of communications for D.C. United. So we already knew him from the year before, so my brother and I also now volunteered again, and that volunteer gig turned into an internship, which turned into the press officer of DC United back in 1997. So that's how I got started.
And then early 2000s, move over to U.S. Soccer. So first, was that the same role, kind of what you're doing now? Was that the same role that you've been doing?
Well, so I was at DC United from 97 to 2000, which fortunately were the glory years. We won 2 MLS Cups while I was there. So I had a ring and a watch, both of which I no longer have. The ring was stolen out of my apartment in Chicago. It had my name on it, so I'm not sure what they thought they were going to do with it. And then the watch, I think I had for about a week. My girlfriend at the time thought it was cool, so I never saw that again. I should probably call her and get that back, right? It's probably sitting in a box somewhere. But then I went to ESPN for a year and a half. So 2000, I went to ESPN and I worked for ESPN International. So that is the network outside of the U.S. Well, what's ESPN going to show outside of the U.S.? Soccer, right? So I watched 8 soccer games a week, and I worked on researching materials for the broadcasters, for the talent, to help them prep for games. But then I also got to learn other stuff. I got to learn how they do graphics. I got to learn how they do production. So I sat in in the production bays when they did games. I had a great boss there who said, when you've got time, I want you to learn whatever you can learn. So I spent a year and a half at ESPN. And if anyone who's ever worked at ESPN, people know that it's in Bristol, Connecticut, which is probably an hour and a half outside of New York City. And other than ESPN, there is nothing else in Bristol, Connecticut. So it's kind of a running joke from employees, hey, so how'd you like Bristol? Well, nobody likes Bristol, but it's a great place to work. And in 2001, Disney, which owns ESPN, they were reducing their workforce by 10%. So anybody who worked for Disney, which I did as an ESPN employee, you could get bought out. And I was kind of ready to leave Bristol. Loved ESPN, but just wasn't great living there. So I was on my way I was going to move to Spain for a year, study Spanish at the University in Madrid, and ESPN was going to use me as a freelancer. So they were going to send me to soccer games. I'm like, wait a minute. You're paying me to leave, and now you're going to pay me to go move over there and live there. So how great a deal is this? Well, at the same time, the coach of the national team was Bruce Arena, and Bruce had been the coach at DC United, from 96 to 98. And so the press officer before me left. I think he said he got resigned was the technical term. It's kind of a long story. He had a little blow up in Honduras with the coach. And Bruce sent me an email. In typical Bruce fashion, it was very warm and sensitive. It was, Michael, would you be interested in working for the national team? Bruce. I wrote back, hey, Bruce, yes. And that's how I got started.
We talk a little bit about the structure of U.S. soccer. Just kind of who are you in charge of? Who reports to you guys? Who do you report to? Because, it can get a little complicated.
So I work in the communications department, right? And we have a director of communications who's responsible for the whole communication side for the federation. And I think one thing that people don't appreciate is when you talk about the federation, what do we do? Right? You see the women's national team, you see the men's national team. That's our flagship programs. That's what everyone knows when they think U.S. soccer. But we're the governing body of the sport. So we oversee coaches, referees, licensing, youth. So essentially it's an administrative body. The vast majority of people that work for U.S. soccer aren't involved with the national teams. We're just the one who gets the most attention, and we're the ones who essentially bring in the dough. But my job with the national team is a little bit interesting in the sense that I have a couple bosses. Right? I work for the director of communications. I work for the president of U.S. Soccer, but I'm inside the team staff. So I've got another boss whose name now happens to be Jurgen Klinsmann. So it's an interesting role at times because I'm an institutional guy, right? So I think you asked last night about what happens when the coach leaves. Is there a new staff when they bring in new people? And the answer is sort of. So they bring in new coaches. They can bring in new trainers if they want, but civil servants like myself aren't under the purview of the coach when it comes to decisions. So you have to adapt to each new situation with the coach, and it's always very different.
Through since you are embedded with the team, you go and you get to like you said, visit all these countries. Wanted you to tell the story of your first visit to Costa Rica. Many of us in this room know of U.S.-Mexico rivalry, but not really realizing how much animosity there may be with some of the other members in our region.
Yeah, so we get asked a lot, what's the hardest place to play outside of the United States for us? And everyone assumed it's Mexico because it's Estadio Azteca. It's 110,000 people. It's at 7,200 feet elevation, and it's one of the most polluted cities in the world. So imagine playing there in the middle of the day in August, and it's a pretty tough day at the office. But the hardest place to play for us actually is Costa Rica. So there's a stadium called Estadio Saprissa in downtown San Jose. And going to the stadium at Saprissa, there isn't an entrance below ground. So a lot of times you see, right, when you go into a stadium, the teams, there's a ramp, you go down underneath. That's where all the locker rooms are. So it's an easy way for teams to get in and out. Well, at Saprissa, there is no entrance below. You come in at street level. And so as we're coming into the stadium, there's no circular drive. You're driving through city streets. So I remember we take a right onto the stadium drive, and there's people jump out in the street and block the road. And now there's people on rooftops, there's people in the street, they're throwing rocks, they're throwing bottles, they're throwing beers, everything at the bus, right? And so the police have to take their shields and make a canopy so we can get into the stadium without getting hit. And now you go into the locker room, and there's a window that's open air so people from the street can yell in. There's no stalls on the toilets, there's no running water, and it's about 90 degrees and no air conditioning. And the supporter section, where the craziest fans sit, is right above the locker room. So the ceiling is literally bouncing. And you can see that we have a video of 2005, if you Google it. You can see the ceiling is bouncing. You're going, are they coming through here? And you can't hear the guy next to you. And that's how the experience starts. And then you get out on the field, and it's 24,000 people. They're whistling through the national anthem, and they can do it pretty loud. And it's really in those moments, when we start to talk about what it's like to represent the United States, you're in a place where you feel like people hate you because of who you are. And we're there to play a soccer game.
You mentioned some of your, when you travel, the reaction that you get or how you kind of were received. Tell me about the perception and how you're received as U.S. Soccer when you guys are abroad.
Yeah, so I think it depends on where we go and what we're going for. So when we go to play in Costa Rica, we go to play to Guatemala, those games are World Cup qualifiers. So these are games that are hugely important. And when we play against those countries, we've been to the World Cup 7 times in a row. Most of the countries that we play against either have never been there or they've only been there once or twice. So to play against the United States at home for them is some of the biggest games they'll ever play. And it's not just the team, it's now the country that rallies behind it. This is a chance to, for lack of an inelegant way of saying it, but this is a chance for them to take on the United States in a way where they think they have a chance to win. And a lot of times they do. Our record on the road in World Cup qualifying isn't great. And when you go into these environments, unless you're there, you probably don't understand why. People think, well, why don't we beat Guatemala? There's 3 million people there. Or why we don't beat Honduras every time. When you go to those places and you experience those environments, it's a difficult place to go and win. And so as a team, we get treated pretty harshly. As a group, we get treated extremely well. So when you're in the hotels, when you're in the restaurants, when you're walking around the streets, you get treated fantastically because they appreciate the fact that you're there. They appreciate the fact that you're involved in soccer, which is something that they love so much. But once you step on the field, it's a whole different ballgame.
Biggest challenges to success on the field for U.S. Soccer?
I think what Jurgen would say is our biggest challenge is consistency. So I asked the question last night. We'll ask it here. How many countries have won the World Cup? Anybody know? Anyone want to guess?
Everyone's counting.
8. Great job. So 8 countries have ever won the World Cup, and 4 of them have only won it once. So when you talk about England, you talk about France, you talk about Spain, some of the best soccer nations in the world, they've won it one time. And England won in 1966. Uruguay's won it twice, the last time was 1950. So it's difficult to be the world champion. What we're trying to do is be a team that can compete to be world champions, right, on a consistent level. So when you're in a tournament and you're playing 7 games to win a World Cup, a lot of things have to go your way. Balls have to bounce your way, referee decisions have to go your way, there's a little bit of luck. But to be a team that's capable of doing it is what we're all striving for. So the biggest thing for us is consistency. In June, you guys who are soccer fans know that we went to play Holland, who finished in 3rd in last year's World Cup, and Germany, who won the World Cup. Well, how many people here thought we were going to win either one of those games? Right? We wound up winning both, and on the road, which we've never done before. So we have the ability to beat the best teams in the world, but can we do it? How many times out of 10 can we do it? And what we're trying to do is move up that number, so more times out of 10 we have a chance of winning.
Because obviously the consistency factor is the next month. You're losing to Jamaica in the Gold Cup. How do you balance the message of U.S. soccer to the 1%, the true hardcore fans, to the casual fans that may tune in for an Olympic qualifier or just a match a year?
Yeah, so I think this is the new opportunity that soccer has in this country, right? So people of a certain generation will say soccer's never going to make it, and I've been hearing it for decades, and soccer's going to be the number one sport. Well, it hasn't happened yet, and it's true. But the difference now is we have a whole new generation of fans, media, sponsors, influencers who grew up with the game in this country. And so they played, their kids played, and now even some, they have grandkids who played. So this bias against soccer in the country doesn't exist anymore, at least not to the same degree. You have a whole new generation of people who grew up as fans of the sport. And so we now have this big opportunity to speak to this new group of fans. And you saw it in the World Cup in 2014 when we had, the United States had the most fans in Brazil other than Brazil. We were the number one group of fan supporters in the World Cup except for the host country. Same thing had happened in Canada with the Women's World Cup. We had more fans there than anybody else. And so there's this new generation and a whole new opportunity for us to tell our story. And one of the biggest shifts now that we're going to try to take advantage of is the new TV deal with Fox. So starting in 2015, Fox has the rights to all of the World Cups between now and 2026. So what ESPN did to grow the sport was massive. They made soccer a real sport, right? What Fox can do, Fox isn't a sports company. Fox is an entertainment company that has a sports division. So what Fox can do for us is introduce us to the entertainment world. They can make us part of the popular culture, which for me is our next plateau. The next frontier for us is to be the ones who are on cereal boxes, to be the ones who are in TV shows, to be the ones who are talked about on shows like American Idol or The Simpsons, which we were with our women in this last World Cup. So that's our next frontier, and that's really where our focus is. Now, at the same time, you can't not service that 1%, the hardcore soccer fan, because that's who got us here. But we're introducing a whole new people to the group of people in sport, and that's who we're trying to speak to.
We kind of addressed, we've talked about this before as well, the parlor game of, well, we'd be better if LeBron played or if Kobe played, if all of our best athletes played. And I think you and I agree that that's not necessarily what U.S. soccer is going to need to take the next step.
So U.S. soccer has made, and do we have any coaches in the room? So U.S. soccer has made a lot of investment in player development. Since 2007, we started the U.S. Soccer Development Academy, with the idea being we need to try to give direction on how the best way to develop players in this country. Prior to that time, there's 50 different state organizations. The U.S. Soccer doesn't run soccer in this country that way. We organize it, we govern it, but it's not like we have a hand in everything. So there's 50 states, there's 50 different ways it's organized, there's 50 different ways that people go about doing it, which is all great. But if we're trying to be a unified soccer nation, if we're trying to develop elite players, there needs to be a little bit more of a consistent message. So U.S. soccer is focused on trying to bring a uniform message. We're not saying that we know exactly how to do it, but we're saying we need to all be on the same page. So there's a big investment in players, but I don't think players is necessarily the biggest issue. I think that the real frontier for us is coaching. In order to have good players, you have to have good coaches. And we have a lot of good coaches in this country, but player development is done when they're kids, right? I started when I was 6. So between 6 and 12, 13, 14 years old is when you're starting to develop the kids, boys and girls, who are going to be elite players. And in order to do that, you need to have good coaches. And a lot of our coaches, bless their hearts, are parents and volunteers, people who are doing it because they want to spend time with their kids or they want to be a part of it, and that's all fantastic, and that all needs to be a part of it too. But for us to get a bigger pool of better players, we have to have a bigger pool of coaches.
I think I know the answer to this, but I want to get your opinion anyway. Once soccer is a dominant sport in the States and the players are celebrity that we're speaking of, and since we're here at the Clinton School of Public Service, what role do you feel celebrities can and should have to impact outside of sports? I know that, you know, majority of what they do and what you do is to make sure the team wins. Whatever all decisions you make is, does this make the team better?
Well, so it's for us, you know, as part of the U.S. national team, I think it's a little bit different. We have a little bit different experience. Guys who are, you know, most of the time most of the year they spend their time with their professional teams, and that's where their development and their focus is. But when we go and represent the United States, there's a special pride and there's a special responsibility to that, and it's always been one of the greatest strengths of our team is our unity, our character, our willingness to fight for each other, and how we take representing our country seriously. And people in soccer, some people outside the United States, but some people even in the United States, kind of snicker at that. They snicker at that. Well, we're not the greatest soccer players, but we can run forever. But there's something to be said for commitment. There's something to be said for pride. There's something to be said for working for the guy next to you. Because I guarantee you, even the best soccer teams in the world, if they don't have that kind of spirit in their group, they're not going to go very far. And you can look at France as a great example. France in 1998 won the World Cup. They were in France. 2002, they didn't get out of their group. And not only did they get out of their group, they didn't score a goal. 2006, they went to the final and they lost to Italy. 2010, they didn't get out of their group and they had a team implosion, so much so that the players refused to train. And so you would consider France one of the best teams in the world, but if they don't have that togetherness, and that's the job of, you know, that starts at the top. That starts with leadership. And it doesn't matter if it's a soccer team or a business or a group in school. If you don't have that type of leadership and commitment to each other, it's going to be very difficult to be successful.
Tell me a little bit about the changing way media has changed since 2001, since you've been there. And so it's such a different environment now than what it was when you started.
Well, there's two big parts for us, right? One is just there's a tremendous more amount of exposure for soccer in this country. So, you know, this soccer fans were the first internet generation of news consumers, right? Because back in 2001, you weren't reading about soccer in the newspaper a whole lot. You weren't hearing about it on TV a whole lot. The places where people could find information about soccer back then was the internet. So we were kind of, our fans and our culture was kind of ahead of the new media that way. But the really, obviously, the biggest difference, which would be no surprise to anybody, is how social media impacts journalism. Not just fans, but how it impacts journalists. The rush to be first as opposed to the rush to be right is a big challenge, not just in the soccer world, but the world of reporting altogether. Because how do you put the genie back in the bottle? And you know, we spend a lot of time on this, and it's a very difficult thing to manage. It's a difficult thing to be out in front of because there's so many different avenues for people to get their information out. Anybody with a smartphone has the ability to make an impact. And so how do you separate the people you're supposed to listen to? Journalists are supposed to be experts. They're supposed to lead discussions. Well, journalism has become a little bit more democratic in that anybody like with a smartphone or a computer can have a voice. And in some ways that's a positive, but in some ways you think, well, how do I distinguish this guy from that guy? Who's the one I'm supposed to get my expertise from? And you have so many different people you have to try to deal with. It's not always easy to pick out the ones who are the right ones.
My last question for you, and then we'll open it up. President Clinton watched some games in South Africa in 2010, and I wanted you to kind of tell that story.
So we've been fortunate that the President Clinton has been a fan of the team. We've actually had the chance to meet him a few times, which has been a remarkable experience. And so the president came to South Africa in 2010, and so our last group game in 2010 was against Algeria. And essentially we had to win in order to go through. Well, hopefully some of you remember what happened in the Algeria game, but so it goes now to the 91st minute. There's essentially 2 minutes left to go. Landon Donovan scores, and now we're through to the knockout round. And when you go from a media side of things in international soccer, one thing that's different than anywhere else, or sports in this country, is no one's allowed in the locker room. So reporters, friends, family, it's sacrosanct. Nobody's supposed to be in there. We do all of our interviews and stuff in a different place, unlike here in the U.S. But bottom line is, you don't go in the locker room. It's expressly forbidden. Well, after we beat Algeria, the locker room was packed, starting with people from FIFA and their friends and family and photographers. Reggie Bush was in the locker room. Somebody pointed out, like, how did he get in here? But then the president. So the president comes in with all of his group, and everyone's taking pictures, getting autographs. And the way the room was set up, the locker room was set up, was there was this big hall. It was almost like this, a little bit smaller, big square space, and the locker room was actually in the back. So the players invite the president to go into the back of the locker room to spend some time with them. And Carlos Bocanegra, our team captain, and Tim Howard, our goalkeeper, there's a rather famous picture of them half naked drinking a beer with the president. My first thought was, and this is terrible, this is how my mind works, my first thought was, is that a sponsor product? I hope so. Which it was. And the second one was, Carlos, do you think you should be posting a picture like that with the president? But, fantastic. So obviously it's a special moment, and one now, it's a different topic, but, just for kids, or the students here, if you've ever seen the video of Landon scoring the goal and the reaction around the world, it's a pretty powerful video. And this was done by a college kid 24 hours after we won. So if you ever get a chance to watch it, you should see it. But now we go into the knockout round against Ghana, and we lose. So we lose to Ghana, we lose in overtime, and the locker room is dead silent, right? There isn't a word being spoken. And now the president is outside the locker room and wants to come in. And it's an odd feeling in that moment. You've got a group that's been together for this 4-year journey. For some of them, this is the pinnacle of their careers, and now it's over. And people are understandably devastated. And you're wondering to yourself, with all due respect to the president, is this a place that he should be? Does he belong in a room with this group of guys who've just experienced this? This is kind of their moment to suffer. But the president comes in, and he speaks to the coach for a couple minutes quietly, and then he just goes to each locker and each guy, looks him in the eye, shakes their hand, and says, "Thank you." And each one of them understood in the moment, what he meant. And to be able to manage that situation with just the right words and just the right tone showed two things. One, just what a remarkable man and communicator he is, but he also showed up when we lost. It's easy to show up when you win and everybody's having a big party, but the harder part is to show up when you lose. And to have that kind of example from the president was one I think that our guys will never forget.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for being here. I want to ask a question that goes one step further than player development. Take Odell Beckham Jr., for example. Very promising talent. He was developing as a potential national team player, and he chooses football. How do you keep the Odell Beckhams in soccer?
Well, it's a great question. And I think one of the positive developments of the success of the national team, men's and women's, and also the growth of MLS, is that there now are stars for people to look up to. I think, kids need to have heroes. Kids need to look up to people and say, I want to be him someday. And in soccer, that's, I think, a piece that's been missing. Not only that, but now it's a viable route to success, too. With MLS, with the players who play overseas, this is a way that kids can achieve that dream. So I think that's a piece that didn't exist before. I think it helps us. I think it also helps the game, and this is going to sound silly, but it's absolutely true, that playing FIFA on Xbox makes a big difference too. We have a lot of kids who know a lot about our players, about the league, about stars in soccer, because they play with them on PlayStation and Xbox and stuff. It's remarkable how often we hear that. But I think the popularity of it is one avenue. And it's not just the Odell Beckhams of the world. We still lose some promising soccer players, not just to other sports, but to the game overall. And I think coaches could probably speak to why that happens.
He's also being selfish because, like I told you, Eagles fan, so he just doesn't want to have to play against Odell Beckham.
Well, I'm a Redskins fan, so
Right.
I'm in misery for the next 20 years.
Thank you. I was curious with the NFL and all the work that's been done on former players, especially you mentioned ESPN, Outside the Lines Sunday morning on Chris Borland. Why have y'all learned from that, and what kind of efforts are y'all making dealing with concussion issues? Because I realize with headers, that is a cause of concussions in soccer.
It's obviously an important topic, and I think soccer is actually one of the sports that's tried to be out in front of it. We do have concussion protocols, which were implemented at the national level and now are trickling down. FIFA has now instituted a concussion protocol, which I think is a huge part of it. So, in international soccer games now, I'm going to take a step back and say this for non-soccer fans. So the guys who know what we're talking about, I apologize. But, in soccer, if a player gets injured on the field, the referee decides whether or not if the player needs treatment. And if he does, then the medical people come on the field, and then they have to come off until the referee allows them back in. And so there's a lot of pressure on those guys the soccer players to stay in the game. And when you're dealing with something like concussions, right, it takes an examination to know whether or not this guy's okay. And the other part with concussions, right, is there isn't always immediate symptoms. So, and I shouldn't be speaking too far into the medical side, but the point is that it requires an evaluation. Well, in soccer, if a guy's off the field for a long period of time, that makes a difference. You can't just put somebody else on to replace him. You're playing down until you either make a substitution or he comes back on. So what FIFA's now done is said, if a medical person suspects a concussion, they can have 3 minutes to make an evaluation and determine if the player needs to come off or not. And that makes a big difference because, again, 3 minutes in soccer is a long time for a game that doesn't ever stop. But they've made that a requirement. So I think it's obviously a huge issue, but for us, we're heading in the right direction.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between MLS and U.S. soccer? So when you call up Sporting KC and say, hey, we want Graham Zusi to come play with us, and how does that work? How does Sporting say, yeah, we'll let you do that? And then how long do those guys play together before you're actually having a match?
Sure. So 2 great questions. So as a starting point, FIFA is the governing body of soccer in the world. They're the one who sets the rules. They're the one who sets the agenda. And one of the things they do every year is publish a calendar and says, on these dates throughout the year, national teams are going to play, and as a club, you have to allow them to play for their countries. This is unlike anything else in any other sport in the world. Imagine if during the NBA season, USA Basketball said, we're taking Kobe Bryant and we're taking LeBron, and they're going to be gone for 10 days to play for their country. It's unique in soccer because historically the national teams have held so much significance in the game. So there's a calendar, and on those dates, players have to be released. Clubs can't refuse. The challenging part in our country is that the FIFA calendar is set up essentially based on how the European professional leagues operate. So European professional leagues operate from August to May. And those these calendar dates within the year, when national teams are playing, those countries stop playing club soccer. So now take another step back and say, imagine now for 10 days, the Lakers aren't playing any games. It just stops. But that's what happens in soccer. And most of the countries around the world adjust their schedule to the international schedule. In the United States, it's different. Our schedule for Major League Soccer is from March until December. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. Competition with other sports, weather. imagine playing January in New England. Snowballs are fun, as we found out when we played Costa Rica in 2013, but it's not the easiest thing to do. So for a variety of reasons, our league is on a different calendar than the rest of the world. So now we play October 10th against Mexico. We have 2 games next month, but let's talk about October. It's a 1-game playoff against Mexico, and the winner will play in the Confederations Cup in 2017 in Russia, which is a huge tournament. That is taking place right in the middle of the MLS playoff race. So there will be MLS teams who are fighting for playoff spots, and now we're saying, your 2 best players are coming with us. There's no way around it at this stage. So it's a difficult balance for coaches. The coaches obviously want to win they want to be in the playoffs. The national team wants to win because we want to win that game and we want to be in Russia in 2017. So it's a huge balance between those, between the national team and the club teams. So how do you sort that out? At the end of the day, at this stage, the national team's success is hugely important to the growth of soccer in this country. Without the national team's success, the league doesn't get to where it is. The league is making huge strides, no 2 ways about it. But we're still, as a national team, the driver. So we need to be successful in order to keep moving the ball forward here. And so you deal with those challenges. But for Sporting Kansas City, you can imagine they're pretty unhappy to lose their 2 best players for a critical time. But that's the reality at this stage. Sorry, what was the second question?
How long do they get to practice?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so 10 months out of the year, these guys are with their professional teams. Every so often, we get to call them in to play games. Now, imagine in the last World Cup, we had players playing in 9 different countries. So professionally, they played in the U.S., they played in England, they played in Spain, they played in Germany. And now you have to get this group of guys together. And when we go in for the game again on October 10th, we'll have 4 days before the game. Sometimes it's 2 days. So you take all these guys from all these different teams and all these different environments, and now you have 2 or 3 days to get them on the same page to play against the best players from another country in a 1 game that has huge significance. So it's the challenge of every national team coach, and what makes them great is their ability to take that collection of guys and in a short amount of time get them on the same page. And it doesn't happen in a day. It's why consistency is so important. When we go in to a national team camp now, I know what the schedule is going to be. I know what training is going to be like. I know what we're going to do the day before the game. What the meals are going to be. And all of that as a way to make it as simple as possible for these guys when they come in to know what to expect. Because it gets you on the same page faster. But yeah, for a national team coach, that's a big, big responsibility.
Hello, my name is Dumas Solomon. I'm originally from Alexandria, Egypt, and I'm a Clinton School student. I come from a country where soccer is like a big deal. It's more important than food sometimes. And lately I've seen, and I love soccer and everything, but lately I've seen soccer, and you said that soccer is an international language, but lately I've seen it as rivalry is becoming too big, and people are becoming violent. Actually, sometimes it ends up in the death of some people getting injured, and it's all because of a game. And so my question is, how can we make sure, or how can we help to make sure that and we remember at the end of the day, this is a sport to get together, not to end up killing each other or something like that. And I have a quick second question is, do you think the U.S. will qualify for the World Cup if they were playing in the Europe or South America?
Well, neither one of those are easy ones, are they? What do you start with on those? Well, we'll take the second one first. Would the U.S. qualify out in a different region? It would be a lot harder, but the process is also different, and there's a bigger margin for error. So if you talk about South America, there's 10 teams in South America, and 4 of them qualify automatically, and the 5th place team plays in a playoff. I don't remember which time. I think they play against Asia this time around. So half of the countries in South America have a chance to qualify for the World Cup. So that's a pretty big margin of error. And I like to think at this stage we'd be in the top of half of that group. In Europe, it winds up being what group you get drawn into, right? So in Europe, I think there's 15 countries go. So there's either 9 or 10 groups in the first phase, and only the first place team automatically qualifies. The second place teams now play, against each other. So I think where you get drawn winds up having a big impact, but it goes back to consistency. Could we consistently compete against, not just the best teams in Europe, but the middle teams in Europe? So when we go and play against Switzerland, which we did back in March, right? So talk about small countries, right? How many people does Switzerland have? People would probably be surprised to know that Switzerland was ranked number 12 in the world at the time. We were ranked number 30. And so there's the kind of a disconnect here in the United States when people hear like Switzerland, like Denmark, not the sexiest teams in the world, but teams with really good players. If you look at where their players play in their clubs compared to where our players play at the club level, they play in better teams. They play in generally speaking, they play in better teams in better leagues. So, it's still a work in progress for us. But at the national team level, could we be consistently good enough? I think the answer is yes. The second one, as with Egypt, I have a little bit of a personal connection there because our former coach was Bob Bradley. He was the coach of the national team from 2007 to 2011, and his next job was the head coach of Egypt. And so he was there during the Arab Spring. He was there during the time when there was the riots at the games where people were killed, and he was the head coach of the national team at that point. And when you talk about how big football is, for Bob being here in the U.S., if he sat in this room, some of you would know who he was, some of you wouldn't. When he was in Egypt, everybody knew who he was, and his job wasn't just to be the head coach of the national team. It was to be, a leader and a speaker. And the way that he handled himself when you talk about international relations, was remarkable. He lived in Cairo. He didn't live outside. He didn't live in other countries, which some coaches do when they're foreign coaches. Some of them don't live in the country where they coach. He lived in the middle of the city. He went to games. He went out to dinners in a time where in certain places it wasn't a safe thing to do. He chose to be a leader when he easily could have said, I'm packing my bags and going home. And so what did that say to the people in Egypt, and what did that say to people in the rest of the world about leadership? There wasn't a better example. But when you talk about soccer and violence, this isn't a new problem. If the biggest rivalries in the world are Rangers Celtic in Glasgow. Okay, so there's two teams in Glasgow. Rangers is a traditionally Protestant team. Celtic is a traditionally Catholic team. You can see it in their colors. You can see it in their songs. I mean, this was a rivalry that extended far beyond soccer. In Argentina, Boca Juniors versus River Plate. One is a team of the people. One is a team of the higher class versus the lower class. I think these wind up being extensions of a bigger problem. And soccer just winds up being the outlet that they use. So if we're able to solve the bigger issues, and I don't know the answer because these things have been going on for centuries, I think that's the root of them. Soccer just winds up being the vehicle, it's not the cause. Yeah,
and there's tons of kind of case studies and organizations that use sports as a mediation technique, whether you look at Rwanda genocide or Middle East, like they use that for opposing sides and force them to play together, and it's a way of peace building. So it can be a destructive force between rivals, but also a way to build community. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Michael, thanks so much for coming down. He'll be around for a little bit if you want to come and say hey, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, man.